with preamble. Andrew Rosindell, who was going to be chairing the meeting, has phoned in and said that he will join us later, but he's running late, unfortunately, at the moment. So he's asked me just to sub for him at the moment. So I'm going to move straight over to Lisa Kerslake, who's the Director of Operations for South and West Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And we're going to, as I say, look at this from very many different angles this afternoon, but conservation in all its facet and how we come out of how we come out of COVID, not in a worse place than we went in. Lisa, over to you. Please unmute.
Rookie error, sorry. Thank you very much, Barry. Thank you for asking me to talk to you this afternoon. So I should explain first that I'm going to, Ben McCarthy, who will speak later from the National Trust, and I are sort of splitting this a little bit. I'm going to concentrate on the impact that has happened and has been happening, if you like, whereas Ben is going to talk a bit more about the future, so just so as we're not repeating ourselves effectively. And I'm going to be covering really the impact that we've noticed on particularly the conservation NGO sector, so wildlife trusts, RSPB, National Trust, Woodland Trust, those sorts of organisations, and just try to give you a flavour really of what's been happening. So just to say, to start with, obviously there was quite a lot of uncertainty at the first lockdown about what was permissible and what was not, simply because it's obviously not possible to cater for absolutely everything in the guidance. So there was quite a lot of time spent evaluating options, making plans, interpreting what this meant for us on our nature reserves and our visitor centres, in our other operations, how we could actually carry on. In some cases, industry bodies managed to get clarification from DEFRA, but this was actually quite rare. Later on, of course, we had COVID secure practices put into place, and we found that we'd got used to what we could do and couldn't do. But actually, at this third lockdown, we had some slight changes again. For example, it may sound simple, but at this time we were told that all bird hides should be closed. And obviously bird hides are quite important to our members, the people who use our reserves. And previously we decided that the best option, because we'd had no instructional bird hides, was to basically take all the doors and windows off to make them as effectively like big bus shelters, so they were as safe as possible. So then saying they need to be closed, that had obviously a potential implication. And obviously this third lockdown, the seriousness began to directly hit staff and members in terms of family members and what have you. So the objections to leaving sites open, even though this was allowed, had grown. So we've had various stresses and strains that we've had to deal with, really. Firstly, there's a direct impact on our sites and our reserves, things like increased footfall, which, you know, extra visitors is great in some ways, but a lot of these people weren't used to nature reserves. It was a green space near to them, and they wanted to use it completely understandably, but that meant that the sites were being used in a way that we hadn't anticipated. There was some vandalism. There were things like hides being used for slightly nefarious purposes, which we then obviously had to deal with. And one surprising impact, certainly in the first lockdown, was that we got a lot of fly tipping because the household waste centres were closed, so people were just dumping litter. So that was, again, an extra bit of work we had to deal with. We obviously got the inevitable complaints from members and volunteers on both sides of the argument. So a lot of people saying, I pay my membership, your site should be open, and others saying, why have you got people on site? You know, you shouldn't be open at all. So there was obviously that thing that we had to balance. And where we couldn't carry out work for reasons of COVID and not allowing people in or what have you, then that led to management delays, untidy and unmaintained sites, and sometimes difficulties with funders, because if we'd been paid to deliver a particular project, particular bit of management, and we couldn't do it, then in some cases then money had to be paid back, which was obviously something that we hadn't anticipated. And along with a lot of organisations, we had a significant impact on mental health for our staff, the furloughing, the isolation. It did, however, bring a more sensible approach to home working, but there's a cost implication in that, but that's something that obviously has been a positive out of it. And obviously some direct financial impacts, I think, particularly for those organisations which were reliant on people through the door, if you like. So, for example, the National Trust would be much more heavily hit than a wildlife trust because they are much more reliant on people coming in, paying an entry fee, going to the shop, going to the cafe, which we tend to have less of. So the income, where they're more reliant on income from visitors and not just membership, that was obviously a significant issue. We had to cancel all our face-to-face engagement and planned campaigns. And again, that's led to a drop in income. And also there's been a withdrawal of some grant funding. For example, the National Heritage Lottery Foundation stopped considering grants. We had a very big bid in. We know a few other people that did as well. And although that is now starting up again, the criteria have been changed. So we're basically starting from scratch from that. So obviously that's an impact. And increased expenses due to things like no car sharing and extra signs. We put signs up everywhere about social distancing and all that sort of thing, obviously is an increased cost. And there were some counterbalances to that, because obviously we had less money spent on travelling to meetings, for example, so that balanced out a bit. And generally speaking, our membership has held up, and I think that's true generally of the conservation organisations, that the people who pay you a regular membership are still doing it. Although my slight concern is that in a few years' time, if the effect on the economy is really bad, then obviously the first thing that's going to go are people's charity subscriptions, which is completely understandable. And so we've ended up, and organisations that have an investment portfolio as well, that's been affected, and we've ended up with several £100,000 worth of deficit, and that's obviously been reflected across the conservation sector. So that's really just a snapshot of the impact that COVID has had directly on us to date, which I hope gives you a little bit of a flavour.
Lisa, thanks very much. It's a depressing picture that you paint. I mean, clearly there are upsides in that you say the footfall has increased, and that's got to be good, that more people have actually appreciated during this time getting out and into wildlife, into nature, and felt that that's been of benefit to them. Hopefully that will translate into your membership in the future.
I would hope so.
That it's something they don't want now to let go of, but it's managing that transition on what are reduced resources.
That's
so
right.
It's certainly a concern. And have you had any interaction with government about how to keep the show on the road, as it were?
Not directly. I mean, what's happened is the Wildlife Trust centrally certainly have been in contact with DEFRA, and obviously representations have been made to funders and things like that about opening things up again as soon as we possibly can. And the professional body that I'm a member of, SAIM, has had quite a lot of direct contact with DEFRA and other relevant bodies in different parts of the country as well, to try to get more precise information from them, which has been in some cases quite useful to do that.
And I presume that the lottery funding that you refer to, the change in the criteria of the grant application, much more is now going to COVID-related themes,
yes,
and health and mental health. And therefore there will be a shift away in the pool of funding that you could potentially have drawn on. Yeah, that's
correct. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Disturbing picture. We go from local wildlife trusts to much more far away. And so, if I can ask Matthew to talk to us about the Gorongosa project, which I think you are the manager of, Matt. So, if you can take us through that, and again, just tell us what the impact has been for you trying to engage in that work, both at an administrative level, but also on the ground.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Lisa. And you almost said Gorgonzola, and I respect that. And one day we will clear up this confusion with that.
Gorongosa, my apologies.
No. So thank you for that. And just quickly, so I wish I was the director of the whole show, but I'm the director of the Sustainable Development Department for Gorongosa Project. And just one note about Gorongosa Project: we're a project that is a human development, sustainable development, and conservation integrated organization with the focus of Gorongosa National Park as an engine for human development and sustainable development in a green economy in central Mozambique. So that's where I am now. Sort of this beautiful picture behind me, although I'm in an office. And I guess I just want to start and say that the integration also includes health, education, conservation, and then my role more on sustainable development and more on working with farmers and farm families. And I want to paint a slightly different picture and just diverge about what our experience has been like, and contextualize what it is like to, having worked here for almost a decade, and been part of a team who's been here for almost 2 decades, is we have been, what this global pandemic really showed us was both the resiliency of our team and our structures as an organization, and the resiliency of our stakeholders and all of the farmers that that I know and work with, all the communities we work with, and that resilience was hard won over these last years, having been through serious political conflict, economic collapse of the currency, almost, we're devalued by half, and then most recently in 2019 with Cyclone Idai, which smashed in this whole area. It was completely flooded, and hundreds of thousands of people were affected. And within weeks, people had their houses up. We, as the Gorongosa Project, we were first responders on the ground with the support actually of the UK and the British High Commission. So, shout out to our friends. They responded swiftly, and that was very much needed and really effective use of the support. And so that experience really taught us, and that was March 2019. Fast forward 1 year exactly, March 2020, they called a global pandemic. And what it meant for us was, those structures that we had built and relied on during the cyclone, during the conflict, during all these past crises, came into play immediately. And the agility of the team and the agility of us to communicate and work on grassroots, and the fact that as a project in a conservation area, we're based here. 99% of our employees live in these houses and work here and are experience these conditions. And I live here 99% of the time. And so the fact that we're here, we saw once again the NGO community and these people having a lot of challenges to get on the ground and have an impact. Meanwhile, Gorongosa Project is here continuing the work. Now, a lot of stuff had to pivot. I realize I only have 50 seconds to go. A lot of things had to pivot. For example, we have education programs focused on girls and stopping child marriage, and eco clubs and doing some education on that. And schools were gone. So we had to really kind of be creative and rethink some of these things. But for farmers and for the agriculture economy, nothing stopped. For 80% of the people we work with are subsistence farmer, nothing stopped. And for our rangers, nothing stopped. And what we found was, as a whole, the situation in terms of human-animal coexistence, or in terms of encroachment, or these things, they happened, and in some very acute situations, they happened even more intensely. But it wasn't a broad brush thing. Everything was very strategic and tactical. And I think that we as an organization, having these agile, that's my alarm, so I think I got 10 seconds just to wrap up and say that, basically that agility really helped. And this time of reflection with our partners, with our stakeholders, with our team members, it was really challenging. People got sick, and people were, especially, I'll just make a shout out to all the single mothers that work with us and work with me, and their extreme effort in this time when there was an extreme burden on them, and their show of resilience and courage. And so that's my, thank you.
Great, Matthew, thank you. I take it you're not actually advocating having a cyclone before an epidemic, but it's really
very British joke. I like that.
But, yeah, sorry, British jokes are really bad. But it's interesting that you found that having operated and having been forced to operate under constrained conditions previously, in a way prepared you better as a team to function during COVID. And I just wonder how, given that the population that you're working with was dealing with the trauma of COVID, and one imagines without the sort of healthcare resources which we in the UK or the global north might consider as standard, how you found it possible to continue to make the case for what you were doing as a priority when people's priorities were naturally focused on the health of their loved ones.
Two short answers. One is the example of the cyclone is really to say that if you're a leader, if you're running an organization, uncertainty should be part, and agility should be part of your strategic thinking. The world of very consistent, year-on-year world that used to exist is going to look a lot more like my world here than it does over there, and that's good and bad, and but just to say that agility is really key to an organization, and everyone should be thinking like that. And then the second part is that the foundational principles of Gorongosa project is that the conservation area and the work being done there are linked directly to human and health services and benefits. So it's the park staff and teams that are working with the government to deliver health and human services. So our teams were on the ground with government, going around in mobile clinics, continuing to deliver services. And here, COVID did affect people more economically and other constraints than it did on the health-wise locally, in this region particularly. If you look at the numbers, although it's increasing now. But the major health crises of the past, again, malaria, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and even tuberculosis, which is very prevalent. Look at malnutrition. The health challenges weighing on the communities we work with are very heavy, and it's been like pushing a rock up a hill. It's been a battle, and these folks are really trudging and really showing their
Matthew,
showing their resilience.
For those of us, or for those people who are listening, who may not understand the way in which the Gorongosa project is structured, can you just explain how you've tied in the project, how you've tied conservation outcomes with benefits for the local community? Because I think that's a really key feature that people might not have understood if they've come to this just on the video.
Sure. And so the two things I'll mention, one is that it's a governance structure, meaning that we have a public and private partnership with the Mozambican government to do human development, sustainable development, and conservation. So we have a legal mandate to work with the government and work with the local communities to deliver certain types of services or augment and amplify the government's own priorities. So that's sort of the legal mandated structure that Gorongosa project operates under. And then practically speaking, is the activities and initiative-based approach towards education, health and human services, conservation. And that means that we as an organization, we're working, we have, for example, we have rangers. So I sit, as a director, I sit on a group where there's a conservation law enforcement professional who's leading the conservation team. There's a human development professional who has, health and education services, and then a science and biodiversity specialist. And so there's a few of us on this team, and it's a very integrated approach. And that's really the model we're trying to champion as a way to use a national park to basically amplify and create a type of economy and really support the government's initiatives that are going on to really uplift.
That's great, because I think it's really important that people understand how the conservation outcomes, how the health of the natural environment is being linked with developmental outcomes for the local population, and I think that's what's really special about the project that you're doing. Look, thank you for that. We go back to the domestic, and you talked about, flexibility, fleet of foot. We now go to the pillar of the establishment. I don't mean, Ben, you particularly yourself, but the National Trust. One can think of fewer organizations that are more indicative of the establishment in this country. Have you been able to be flexible and fleet of foot in the way that Matthew was saying, and how has it impacted you and the conservation work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I think we have been fleet of foot. It's certainly been a tremendous effort across the entire organisation to respond to the necessary restrictions following the coronavirus pandemic. I guess the impact on us have been certainly financial, as kind of Lisa alluded to, but also we've recognised the kind of big social and kind of cultural changes. And I think that's been one of the biggest issues which have been brought to the fore. Not necessarily that that it's surprising that people are noticing nature, because of course the profound effect on people of nature, beauty and history is the very essence, the foundation for which the National Trust was established. But I think what's been brought to bear over the last 10 months or so has been how this is building into a powerful case for action. People are reaching out to be closer to nature just at the time when they're being forced inside. And I think that demonstrates the significance and the importance, the kind of biophilia that kind of E.O. Wilson talked about, which is coming to the fore. And despite a global pandemic, the kind of nature and indeed climate crisis are still very high amongst our members and indeed the visitors to the National Trust estate, who are really increasingly reliant on the benefits that high quality natural green space provides. So the challenges then are kind of not losing momentum that was being picked up not only by ourselves and the wider sector, but indeed by government. And I think there's real concerns as the economic fallout of the pandemic become more apparent, that we don't lose sight of delivering and adequately resourcing the 25-year plan, including adequately resourcing our natural assets, which are of course fundamental to economic well-being and quality of life. I think we need to keep a steady eye on that investment to ensure that there's coordinated and coherent plans for delivering the 25-year plan and all that entails. And if I was to draw out a couple of key issues, one would be around getting better and more integrated environmental data. So we're working off a stronger evidence base to inform local decisions. Transforming the urban green infrastructure and reinvigorating that debate, because it's very clear that there's significant levelling up required in terms of the inequality of access to quality places and natural rich local green spaces. And the final issue, I guess, is ensuring that we're investing in local authorities and other key public bodies so that they can play their part, not least in delivering the new planning reforms adequately and in keeping with the 25-year plan, but also in other key public bodies, for example, Natural England, and ensuring that they're able to progress their work in improving the condition of triple SIs. I think you're on mute, Barry.
Thanks, Ben. Where you talk about getting more integrated environmental data, what is it that you need there that currently you feel you're lacking? And when, well, let me go with that first, and then we can talk about the equality of access issues that you raised, which I think are also really fundamental, particularly in the light of COVID.
So the government's introducing in its white paper some relatively or some quite fundamental changes to the way the land use planning system works. And I think fundamental to that success is for it to be underpinned by high quality, accurate environmental data to ensure that land use is indeed sustainable. You know, the core function of our land use planning system is around kind of sustainable development, and that is absolutely predicated on a good evidence base. But I think you can go beyond kind of the built environment and development to kind of better understand where our natural capital exists, and we at the National Trust are investing significant amount of effort to improve the quality of our natural environment evidence base, such that we can invest in the natural assets which are so fundamental to, you know, the economy and social well-being. So, for example, how do we ensure that we're getting the best bang for our buck in terms of future agri-environment schemes, and how can we ensure that that's securing public benefit for the public money that those land managers are delivering? And I think this leads to a kind of broader point around developing more sustainable rural land use economies, especially for us at the National Trust, where much of our estate is in the rural hinterland.
Yeah, good. And before we move on from you at the National Trust, you talked about inequality of access. And I think if you look at the groups that everyone tells us have been most disadvantaged during COVID, that have suffered some of the severest mental health challenges, and also very often the communities that are, I don't know for what reason, but evidence suggests are less likely to be receiving the vaccine, then they map over to the groups that you are most challenged to encourage to come into National Trust properties. How is COVID affecting your thinking there? Have you seen a shift in the demographic that has come through into some of your properties, or is it still an even greater challenge for you?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think you know, fundamentally you're right. We have seen this kind of public outreach to nature and getting close and noticing nature, and that's, as I say, you know, the basis, the foundation of the National Trust's kind of core charitable purpose. So in that sense, it's not surprising. I guess one of the issues is that the pandemic has really driven that home to communities who I think were less used to visiting natural environment space, and we absolutely welcome them. And there's a challenge in terms of the sheer numbers at some of our kind of key honeypot sites, and frankly some of those are being swamped because large numbers of people are descending on those honeypots at kind of key kind of times, like over the weekend, for example. And that poses a whole number of very kind of practical kind of challenges. You know, we've seen significant erosion in our footpath networks, for example, through some places like Box Hill. I guess one of the kind of focus of our efforts, though, is really to engage those communities and indeed bring it closer to themselves, to their homes and their communities, which is why, amongst other things, we're committed to developing 20 local green corridors, which is helping reconnect urban communities out into the kind of more rural hinterland, and creating opportunities for more people to kind of get engaged, appreciate, and kind of understand the natural environment around them.
Great. So encourage everybody to be engaging in the Big Bird Watch. What is it? 10 days time? 9 days?
Yes, the Big Bird, Big Garden Bird Count.
Big Garden Bird. Yeah. So,
absolutely, and that again, of course, plays into the environmental data and shows kind of the opportunity there is for everyone to be involved. So you know, there's some kind of key messages around getting out, getting close to nature, which is absolutely what we want to encourage, but ensuring that people are leaving no trace behind them, and also kind of accessing the environment in a way which isn't kind of harming the very things that they want to come and see and enjoy.
Indeed. Great. So globally we go again, Helen, and with one of my favourite organisations in the world, I suppose, the Royal Zoological Society of London, and you can't get much more global than you guys. So tell us, because I know that ZSL has been doing a lot of work, particularly around COVID, and looking at the new institute that is proposed to set up for zoonotic diseases. And so there's a huge element of your work that is both developed from COVID, but is affected by it. So tell us, how's it been?
Thanks so much, Barry. So I'm actually, you're doing me a slight honour there, but I'm Head of Conservation and Science at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, which is the charity that works Edinburgh Zoo and Highland Wildlife.
Region 2.
But we do work, so we're all part of the BIASA network, and we work very closely across a whole range of zoo and aquarium organisations. So I am here representing organisations like ZSL and Bristol and Chester Zoos. But in total, in our ZSS, we work on 23 conservation projects in Scotland and UK's overseas territories and around the world. We run a highly specialised conservation genetics lab, and we conduct a wide range of educational, veterinary and scientific work. And with our colleagues across BIASA zoos, we support work on projects on around 500 species in over 100 countries. And I recognise a lot of the challenges that my colleagues have been talking about. And it's definitely fair to say that it's probably no surprise to you that the pandemic has put quite a bit of this work at risk. In a more normal year, BIASA Zoos and Aquariums bring our 36 million visitors face to face with living animals, and a lot of our visitors come from a whole variety of different places, and I think zoos are a really important place for connecting people with nature, particularly within cities, etc. And jointly we run over 1.2 million educational visits, whether that's primary school children caring for wildlife gardens or undergraduates honing their scientific skills through the observation of animal behaviour. And our zoological institutions are unique scientific resources. We translate science directly to animals in the wild, from dietary analysis for tigers or pregnancy testing in rhinos. And in the wild, we're hands-on with countless conservation projects around the world, whether that's GPS tagging critically endangered flapper skates on board a research vessel off the west coast of Scotland, or conducting surgery in Cambodia on sun bears maimed by the illegal wildlife trade. But breeding animals for release is also a truly unique role that we perform, and this has been critical in the conservation of all sorts of species, from the scimitar horned oryx in North Africa to the mountain chicken frog on Montserrat. And managing animal populations on the brink of extinction like this requires long-term planning, especially for animals with long life cycles. It needs a lot of science to get breeding and husbandry right, collaboration between institutions in order to keep sufficient population sizes for genetically healthy captive populations. And for example, the critically endangered wildcat population, which is managed by our ZSS and destined for release in Scotland as part of the Saving Wildcats project, and hopefully in other areas of Britain, is held by over 30 committed participating institutions who are all currently being impacted by COVID-19. And many of our organisations also have projects that are dedicated solely to the conservation on the ground, grown out of the first-hand knowledge that captive breeding and release, whilst it is sometimes necessary, is really a desperate last resort. And since 2005, our ZSS have been a main financial supporter of the Budongo Conservation Field Station in Uganda, a project which monitors and conserves a population of 800 chimpanzees in the largest tract of forest in East Africa, and does much community engagement work. And much of this experience of the holistic conservation management is driving the standards of species recovery and progress on wider issues. Many of us trained practitioners from around the world. Chester have led on a major campaign for sustainable palm oil. The Deep have just led on an exercise to understand the red list conservation status of over 500 aquatic species. And in normal times, this sort of work is funded largely by the income from our visitors, something that's obviously been devastated by the pandemic. And we're successfully able to use this funding to leverage additional grant money, but grant funding does come and go. And one of the real values of zoo-funded conservation is that we've been able to generate the sort of long-term commitment that's required for the long haul of species and habitat recovery, stuff that takes decades and not just 3 to 5 years. And with our zoos shut, this funding tap's been turned off, and we have to prioritise the life-critical care to our animal. And many staff who are not on the front line have been furloughed or made redundant, and this means we're losing key skills. And some of the impacts are being felt immediately. For example, the Wild Planet Trust have told me that they've had to pull out of their support for conservation breeding of the endangered white-clawed crayfish. The Deep have been unable to send skilled staff to provide critical rehabilitation to the care of wild turtles. Many of us can't get out into the field to carry out survey work, and if we've had to delay animal releases, or just we've had a particularly successful breeding year, we're having to hold more animals at a time when we have less resources. We've had an overwhelmingly good breeding year for the critically endangered pine hoverfly, and now we're scrambling to try and work out how to expand capacity and staffing and infrastructure at a time when we don't have very much money. And so unfortunately, the pandemic worries won't end with a vaccination. We've had to take out sizable loans to cover our ongoing animal care operations, but these will still need to be repaid using operating surplus that's normally directed towards our conservation, education and science work. And over the coming years, we're worrying that we'll suffer the death of 1,000 cuts from our conservation work. And BIASA does expect the permanent loss of a number of zoos and aquaria. And so with the greatest respect to everyone here, the government response for our sector hasn't been strong enough. In England, the restrictive zoo animals fund ends soon with only 5 million of the £1 million distributed. And in Scotland, the equivalent scheme is also restrictive. As of today, no major zoo in England or Scotland has been eligible for support from either scheme. And so our plea is for government support that gets us back on track, so that we can continue to deliver for species, the wild places they depend on, and to educate and inspire the next generation who will grow up to become their guardians.
Helen, thanks. You chastise us quite properly, I think, as parliamentarians, and I know that you will know that Andrew drafted a letter which I, as chair of the All-Party Nature Group and the All-Party Group on International Conservation, co-signed with him and many of our colleagues. And we did take this issue of funding up with ministers, but unfortunately they did not change the criteria in the way that we had suggested to make it more available to zoos around the country. And we're acutely conscious that the fallout that you've predicted would be disastrous, not just in terms of public accessibility, but actually particularly in terms of the conservation work that you do, which is so vital. So thank you for setting it out so starkly. And I'm sure that many of us who are, from Parliament who are on this Zoom and listening in will reinforce the message on the back of what you've said. So thank you for that. Now it's time to try and open up to questions and answers to our panel. So if you are with us on the Zoom, although not necessarily on the screen, please do put questions into the Q&A. That's what it's there for. And I'm not sure who's operating the technology behind everything, but if that needs to affect a
I can bring everyone on screen now.
That would be great if you can. Thanks so much. Yeah, bring everybody up, and then we can see people. And please do. It's probably best if people raise their hand. That's the little yellow hand at the bottom of the screen. If you'd like to make a contribution or ask a question, just make a comment about what one of our panelists has said. I've got a question that's been submitted from Mark Prinner. on the Q&A already. Mark, if you're there, would you like to ask it yourself rather than me try and read it off the screen? It's probably better that you unmute and ask the question yourself.
Might be a fairly low-level question, but UK conservation relies a lot on volunteer practical conservation base, and there's been a lot of questions and discussions about whether we're allowed to, whether we should just cancel any practical conservation work, or whether we should find ways of working something around it. Now, I know that with the recent variants of the disease, the risk has increased dramatically. But before that, we were still floundering around a bit, trying to ensure that we did the practical conservation work that we needed to continue, even in COVID, and getting people out as well, doing stuff that is beneficial to them as well. I wondered what other people had experienced in their various organisations.
Great. Well, Lisa, that seems tailor-made for you, talking about volunteers to start off with anyway.
Yeah. Hello, Mark. Yes, yeah, we rely a lot on volunteers, as a lot of wildlife trusts and similar organisations do. And it has been really difficult, actually, to decide what's the right thing to do. Because, as I said at the beginning, inevitably, you can't write guidance that pinpoints an answer for every single situation. So you have to kind of interpret it and think, well, can we do this safely? Even if we can do it safely, should we do it safely? Because are we encouraging people to come from further afield and therefore travelling more than we want them to? And obviously, each lockdown has been slightly different, so the response has been slightly different. And in the first lockdown, we were a lot more cautious and shut down all the volunteer work while we worked out what we could legally and safely do. Once we had COVID secure working in place, then we opened it up a bit. But we were very, very careful to ensure that it could only be done if people could travel there without sharing a car, if the work itself could be done individually, so people didn't have to share tools, for example, share gloves, that sort of thing, and that they were comfortable doing it, because we've had a whole range with our volunteers from people who have been nagging us to get back out on site and help, and others that are frankly scared and don't think we should be doing it at all. So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, I think. But so what we've done really is, where we think it's safe, we've said, please come and volunteer if you're local. We've emphasised the stay local message very much so. But if you are in any way uncertain, or if as a volunteer manager within the trust, you don't think it's quite safe, or you don't think we should be doing it, then you have the absolute right to say, no, we won't do it. So that, I realise it's not a terribly clear answer, but it isn't a terribly clear situation.
Yes. And local, I take it, is 7 miles or less. Is that right?
I couldn't possibly comment, Barry.
Helen, how about you? How have you dealt with this whole issue about volunteers, and because I'm sure it's impacted on you as well and the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, we've used I consulted with the RSPB at Ouse Valley, Cambridgeshire Reserves, and they had adapted a document that was published by the Welsh Government for doing personal risk assessment. So as most volunteers are of a certain age, they often fall into vulnerable categories or at-risk categories. So the Welsh Government actually put together a document where each volunteer could self-assess themselves and come out with a risk score, which you could then discuss with them as the supervisor of the work parties and decide what the best way forward would be. I think it's been a bit superseded, actually, because things have just escalated so much since then with the added risk. So we are being extremely careful now. We only have pairs of volunteers if they're the same household. And other than that, you'll just have to work on your own, just one person on the site, in view of the supervisor for the risk. Obviously, the risk assessment, you've got to have a first aider present. So it's quite tricky. It's very limited. It's time consuming to organise it, but we just try and keep what we can moving, which is pretty limited now because things have got so serious.
Yeah. Helen, did Scotland do anything similar to the Welsh Government in terms of those self-assessment forms? Or how have you coped with that?
Yeah, so I mean, for us volunteers, I think across the sector, using volunteers is particularly challenging. But of course, with our zoos, we do normally rely on or involve quite a lot of volunteers in our work. And at the moment, or even when the zoos were open, we were really scaling back the staffing levels just to ensure that we don't have that added risk of transmission. So for a whole variety of reasons, actually, volunteers are not able to come on site at the moment. And we have a number of, for example, we have a number of volunteers and students who work with our conservation projects on site, and at the moment it's not possible to bring them on site.
Presumably, though, you can't just lay people off. If you have, a specialist in a particular species of fish in an aquarium, you can't just lay a specialist off, because that means you lose that expertise and you critically endanger the fish that you have. So there are limits to how you flex, going back to what Matthew was saying about flexibility, how you can actually flex your workforce. So what's the danger if you're laying off non-specialists in that sense, of actually not being able to gear back up post-COVID?
Well, I mean, I suppose the most critical point is that we can't furlough the fish or the tigers. So we have to, although we've taken advantage of the furlough scheme, to as large extent as we can, we actually have to maintain a considerable staff base to maintain life critical operations. And yes, of course, animal husbandry and breeding is an extremely, and veterinary care and the science is all extremely specialised. So in terms of, there is a real risk of losing specialised skill if we have to go down the route of reducing staff. Yes.
No. Look, many of the organisations who've spoken have multiple elements to them. Work with education, with science and communities. Has that variety helped or hindered you during the pandemic? I don't know if Ben or Matthew want to respond to that question.
I'm happy to just jump in and say that it's been a real I think, as always, it's part of our resilience is the interdisciplinary approach that we use in this in all of our activities. I think it's always helped us to view these challenges from multiple different angles and then find synergies. And that's that's a kind of a cheesy word, but I mean, it's this idea that, together we can figure out these ways to create, to have more impact in what we're doing and to overcome certain challenges. So, practically speaking, our conservation team, there was a very acute hunger challenge in this one part of this community, partly due to COVID, because of how it affected the markets actually, and the impact on the markets because of the commodities. And so we, as the Sustainable Development Department, jumped in there with some additional relief and some additional resources, because the occurrence of illegal hunting was happening at such a high level. So it was able to, again, sort of use each other's strengths, and that was a bonus for us.
Really interesting, fascinating example of illegal hunting going on there as well, and the impacts on the markets. That's what, back in 2003, that was precisely why I set up the UK Bushmeat campaign, because it was the impact that those illegal markets were having and how they'd become international all those years ago and were coming into London, really disturbing. So the way in which the market flexes and influences this is really critical. Ben, how about yourself with the National Trust? That sort of variety, you are, above all, have all those elements of education, conservation. Tell us more.
So I think at that kind of headline level, the kind of the impact of COVID on the National Trust and our conservation work has been very significant. The financial impacts meant that effectively we put in a pay freeze, which stopped our conservation activity happening. That is a lot of the work which is undertaken by volunteers, for example, and we were following kind of good practice in terms of ensuring everybody's safety. As a slight aside, there has been produced technical guidance, kind of best practice from SEAM and others about how to enable kind of field work to continue safely during COVID. We were able to adopt that where possible, but by and large, most of our work closed down, either because of government policy and guidance, or because we had to save money. And it will take a very significant amount of time to kind of rebuild. We think we've been pushed back to a situation about like we were back in 2016, and so the recovery is going to be long and slow. And I guess it's been a double-edged sword, our exposure to a variety of different fronts. I think it goes some way to explaining why we've been so significantly hit financially, but also on a more positive side has enabled us to respond with new, novel, innovative ways of engaging with not only our membership, but the public at large. So we've all been on a very steep learning curve, not only working these new technologies, but trying to make sure that we can get our online offer out there to support things like educational programs, so that we can support and contribute as much as we can. And in some places, we've been extremely successful with some kind of online activities being able to be accessed in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise.
And look, we're coming up against the 5 o'clock allotted slot, but I do want to just make a plea to anybody who has a burning question that they want to put. Please do step in, raise your hand, unmute yourself if you so wish. Is there anybody who's Wendy, you almost put your hand up there. I saw you. See that's the danger when you.
Yes, sorry, Barry. Yeah, I'll just very quickly then. I hear a bit of noise in the background, but I don't think it's coming from my end. I've got two. I'm Northeast Fife, so I've got St Andrew's Aquarium, which I know did struggle to access Scottish Government pivotal funding in the first instance, and also the Deer Centre in Cooper, which actually, as a result of the collapse of Edinburgh Woolen Mill, was impacted. And I think the key thing was animal welfare was absolutely critical in both those cases, and staff went above and beyond, which I'm very grateful for. And not for sharing beyond this call, but the Deer Centre has secured a new owner, which is fantastic news. But thank you, everybody.
My old stomping ground up in St Andrews, my first university. Yeah, very good. Look, I just want to sort of bring it to a close then, if there are no further contributions from the floor. What we've heard is really, in many senses, stories of remarkable resilience, given the crisis that people have faced. And that's something that is encouraging. We've also heard that people who may not have appreciated the work that the four of your organizations are doing to the same extent previously, are much better attuned and aware of their need for you and the work that you do and their need to access nature. I think the mental health toll that COVID has put on people, not just in the UK, but absolutely around the world, has made people understand not just that they're connected in a bad way to nature through zoonotic disease, but actually in a good way to nature as part of their own health and well-being. And so the work that everybody here is involved in, and by that I don't just mean our panelists, but all of the people who are here in name only, not showing their pajamas on video, all of the work that you're involved in is vital, and we have to ensure that it not just survives COVID, but prospers and goes beyond COVID. Next year, we have two absolutely critical events. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity in Kunming, which of course is uppermost in all of our minds in terms of biodiversity and species survival and landscape management. But also, of course, the way in which that will feed into COP26 and the whole emphasis that as president of COP, we will be putting on nature-based solutions as part of climate change action. So let me just thank all of you for the work that you're doing. Thank you particularly to our panelists for sharing with us this afternoon, and wish you all every success. I can assure you that Andrew and I and others in the all-party groups will continue to make the case for the importance of the work that you're doing, for the need for government to recognise that, and to make sure that you have the resources that you need to survive COVID and prosper beyond. So with that, I'll say thank you very much to everyone, and you can press the little red button that says leave. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.